and World Peace, How the Treatment of Women Affects Development and Security. My name is Sandeep Patal, and I'm a program associate with the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The ECSP, or the Environmental Change and Security Program, is 18 years old, and we look at the various connections between health, environment, livelihoods, population, security. Today's program on Sex and World Peace is brought to you under our HELPS program, or HELPS project, which ironically also stands for Health, Environment, Livelihood, Population, and Security. And that project is generously funded by the USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. It's a 5-year effort for us to learn more about these connections, and I see many familiar faces and friends in the crowd. So as many of you know, the Woodrow Wilson Center is a living memorial to the 28th president. He was our only president thus far to have achieved a PhD. And the Wilson Center aims to bring the worlds of policy, practice, and academia together to gain a better understanding of how to inform each other. You have the speakers' bios in front of you today, but I do just want to quickly introduce everybody. We are first going to hear from Valerie Hudson, who is a professor and the George H.W. Bush Chair at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. We are going to then hear from Chad Emmett, who's an associate professor of geography at Brigham Young University. Fear not, we will be hearing from Jenny Klugman. She's the Director of Gender and Development at the World Bank Group, and she actually had to do an event at the World Bank, so she should be joining us within the next few minutes. And then we're going to have Rich Sankata, who's the demographer in residence at the Stimson Center and a consultant with our Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. He's going to wrap everything up as a discussion towards the end of the event. I do just want to make a quick note about today's meeting being webcasted live. And what that means for you actually is that when we turn to the discussion portion of the event, we're going to ask you to use a microphone and to introduce yourself and affiliation for those that are tuning in from afar. So why don't we get ourselves started today? We're going to, as I mentioned, hear first from Valerie and Chad, who are going to talk to us a little bit about their new book, Sex and World Peace. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. I've been a fan of the Woodrow Wilson Center for many years, and their blog, The New Security Beat, is one of my must-read blogs. Very pleased to be here with you. I have a feeling we'll be preaching to the choir, but nonetheless, I think it will be fun. And before I start, I'd like to recognize the fact that 4 of our former WomenStats coders who labored so long to build this database are here today. And so I would like them to stand. There's Melissa Paredes and Diane Bailey, Thelma Young, and Joanne London. And I, for one, am going to give them a big hand. All right. Well, Sandeep said Sex and War, but you know what? We looked for the title Sex and War, and 2 male authors had already taken it. So we women were stuck with Sex and World Peace, and I think that's actually a better title. So, Sandeep, help me figure out, how do I go to my PowerPoint? This one. Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. All right. So hopefully the clicker will work. All right, let's see what happens. Yes, very good. Those of us who wrote Sex and World Peace were a multidisciplinary group, a geographer, psychologist, and 2 political scientists. And I'm one of the 2 political scientists. And as we approached this topic, I've got to tell you that most of my colleagues in security studies back 10 years ago felt that women and security studies kind of did not inhabit the same universe. So if we were talking about sources of conflict and instability within and between states, we would be looking at things such as the democratic peace or its converse, the democratic deficit. We'd be looking at ethno-nationalism. We'd be looking at resource scarcity, ideological conflict. We'd be looking at balance of power issues, all of these things. But you'll notice that what's happening with women is certainly not on the agenda. However, in recent years, we've begun to see a fascinating drumbeat of high-level policy voices beginning to assert that there is a relationship between the security of women and the security of states that they live in. And so here's a great quote from Kofi Annan in 2006, back when he was Secretary General. He said, "The world is starting to grasp that there's no policy more effective in promoting development, health, and education than the empowerment of women and girls." And he goes on and says, "And I would venture that no policy is more important in preventing conflict or in achieving reconciliation after a conflict has ended." Now, that was 2006, but since then, we've seen more and more. Okay? And now with the establishment of the Office of Global Women's Issues and the quadrennial diplomatic review, we're seeing an increasing emphasis on women. It has not necessarily trickled down to academia. When I first presented my research agenda to my department, now this was not Texas A&M, this was Brigham Young University back when I was at Brigham Young University. There were 2 women in a department of 30. And when I presented this research, my male colleagues told me, literally, this is what they said, that I was barking up the wrong tree. And that if I wanted to look at blood spilt and lives lost in, for example, the entire last century, I would be much better off looking at ideological conflict, democratization, and forces of that nature. Well, I'm sure it won't surprise my former coders that I was not dissuaded by their poo-pooing of what we were going to do. So I went back to my office and I did a little thought experiment. Okay, I attempted to find, through some wonderful compendia, what the death totals from wars were in the 20th century. And so you can't see this very well at all, I'm very sorry to say, but let's see if we've got a pointer here. We've got World War I and World War II, we've got Stalin, we've got Mao, and then those are the big death tolls. And then I went out and I found more civil wars and genocides and conflicts and so forth. I added as many as I possibly could, and I came up with a total of about 152 million over the course of the century of lives, male or female, that had been lost. And then I looked at what the estimates of missing women in Asia at the turn of the century were. So that's not the whole century. That's just one part of the century, one generation, if you will, of the century. And the estimates go from, my own conservative estimate was about 90 million for just 7 nations, and then much higher if we looked at all of Asia. But then I found that the UN Population Fund had estimated that the number of missing women in the world at the turn of the century was 163 million, was their estimate. Well, that's interesting, because that's more than the 152 million that I had identified in looking at all of the wars and conflicts of the 20th century. So by the standard that my colleagues wished me to use, blood spilt and lives lost, those were, in the first instance, female lives. And so we would be remiss if we did not look at the relationship between the security of women and security on the world stage. Now, we know that the security of the state impacts the security of women. I think all we have to do is look at places like DR Congo, and we know that that's true. But what I'm interested in, what Chad and I are interested in doing, is sort of putting that question on its head and asking, does the security of women impact the security of states? And again, I think everyone in this room probably knows, but we think our theoretical framework, which I won't go into here, asserts that when there arise male dominance hierarchies, which dominate women in the first place, and then use that template of dominance to extend their reach over other groups and other men, that you get societies that are inherently unstable, inherently violent, and inherently authoritarian. Okay? And we know, however, that that is not some sort of evolutionary destiny. that, in fact, quite a number of societies have begun to mitigate male dominance hierarchies as a form of governance. And so we can differentiate in the world between societies that have sort of the traditional male dominance hierarchy approach to governance and those that have moved beyond that to some degree. So what we argue in our book is, instead of, for example, looking at Samuel Huntington's civilizations as the engine of state conflict, okay, what we're interested in suggesting that perhaps the engine of state conflict is actually a clash of gender civilizations. In fact, what we have discovered is that the very best predictor of how insecure and unstable a nation is, it's not its level of democracy, is not its level of wealth, is not what Huntington civilization it belongs to, but is in fact best predicted by the level of violence against women in the society. Even quote-unquote democracies in which women are treated very poorly have security profiles that look like non-democracies. All right, so if we did sort of a survey of the literature, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you in the room had not participated in doing this research, we would raise some interesting questions that link what's happening with women with what's happening at the nation-state level. Food security. As we know, one of sort of the invisibles is that women grow at least half of the food worldwide, and in some areas like Africa, perhaps over 80%. However, their land rights are severely restricted. About 2% of arable land is in the hands of women in these less developed countries. We know that women have this double day where they're expected not only to grow food, but also to provide all reproductive labor, including physical reproduction itself. However, when the government sends out land extension agents, those are usually men who talk only to men. And we know that remuneration for cash crops is usually given to the male, quote-unquote, head of household and not to the women, despite the fact that we know from various studies that 95% of a woman's earnings will go to her family, but only 40 to 60% of a man's earnings will go to his family. We know that 2/3 of all malnourished children are female, and in many societies we know that there are norms that suggest that women and girls must eat last. So we raise the question, might inequitable treatment of women make famine and malnutrition more likely, make the nation less food secure than it otherwise would be? And we feel the answer is probably yes. I know you're aware of a series of fantastic World Bank studies which looks at the relationship between the gender gap, that is, the larger the gender gap, the larger the difference in the treatment of men and women in society, and a variety of economic indicators. And what the World Bank found was that the larger the gender gap, the lower the GDP per capita of the nation. The larger the gender gap, the lower the rate of national economic growth. Lower investment in female education is linked to lower national income. That's the work of Elizabeth King. And economic development projects with a gender component are much more successful than those without. So we raise the question, might inequitable treatment of women make poverty more likely for the nation? Health in women. This is kind of intuitive here, but let's put some actual correlations into play. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the infant and child mortality rates, the lower the child malnutrition rates. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the share of household income spent on cigarettes and alcohol. The larger the gender gap, the higher the AIDS rate and the higher the rate of infectious diseases. And the larger the gender gap, the lower the life expectancy, not just for women, but for men. And so we ask, might inequitable treatment of women make disease and ill health more likely for the nation? And so, yeah, we say yes. State conflict in women, this is my area of expertise. And so what we found is the higher the level of violence against women, the more likely a nation state is to be non-compliant with its treaty obligations. That's interesting. The higher the level of violence against women, the worse the nation state's relations with its neighboring countries. The larger the gender gap, the more likely a state is to be involved in inter- and intra-state conflict and also to use violence first in such a conflict. And the higher the level of violence against women, the less peacefully the nation state will conduct itself overall in the international system. So we ask, might inequitable treatment of women make conflict more likely for the state? And we answer yes. Governance in women, there's some fabulous findings here that I'm sure you're probably familiar with. The larger the gender gap, the higher the levels of both perceived and actual government corruption. The lower the gender gap, the greater the level of trust in government and the greater the degree of transparency in government. And when representation of women in these decision-making councils is higher, more attention is given to social welfare issues, fighting corruption, and improving legal protections for the citizens. And some work that my own graduate student at Yale University is doing. When women are represented in peace negotiations, participants are not only more satisfied with the outcome that is negotiated, but the agreement holds for a longer time. The agreement is more durable when women are involved in the negotiations. In demographics and women, and Rich can certainly speak to this, what we have found is in societies where women have virtually no rights or very little rights in marriage, we find that is associated with unsustainably high fertility rates. But on the converse, we also find that when societies make caregiving economically irrational, completely economically irrational, we see sub-replacement birth rates. So might inequitable treatment of women make demographic problems more likely? And the answer would be yes. So the question we pose in the book, Sex and World Peace, is might one great key to the structural and physical violence we see around us in this world be the inequitable treatment of women? And that raises some interesting questions, because if that's one of the taproots, then maybe we would have more success in helping the international system to be more peaceful if we concentrated less on our export of democracy or free market economics and more on holding nations accountable to their obligations under CEDAW. As Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has said, and boy, I just love this, the subjugation of women is a direct threat to the security of the United States. Even 10 years ago, people would have guffawed if they heard someone say this. No longer. Okay, the results are simply too numerous and too robust. And so just to say a little bit about the work, 10 years in the making and a commitment to empirical research, because we know that there are certain policymakers and certain academics that will not even look if you do not include a large and aggregate statistical test of your assertions. So we decided that we were going to do just that. The structure of the book, and then I'll pass it on to Chad, is and it's meant to be read in classrooms, and it's meant to be read by laypersons. But I also think those of you in the room who do this for a living will also find some fascinating stuff in there as well. But it's the kind of book that you could give to your niece. So Cecily, can I give this book to you? Yes. So we define key terms. Thank you, Cecily. And then we talk about what we call the three wounds. The three wounds that women have received in the house of those who should have been their friends. Okay, lack of physical security, lack of equity under the law, especially personal status law, and lack of parity and representation in the councils of humanity. We then look at scaling and mapping of the situation of women worldwide, and Chad's going to do that for us. We adumbrate our theoretical framework. We do that aggregate statistical testing. And then we survey top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches that we feel would be helpful. And we end with a call for an R2PW. Okay? That is to suggest that we are not as helpless as we think if we are trying to improve the status of women worldwide. Okay, and then I think you know about the Women's Stats Database. If you don't, you will after reading this. Okay, largest compilation of information on the status of women anywhere in the world is on the womenstats.org website. Over 132,000 individual data points for 325 variables for 175 countries, all countries with at least 200,000 population. It is completely free to you online, and it contains qualitative information, qualitative data, as well as our own scalings and mappings of the situation of women worldwide. And with that, I'm going to turn it all over to Chad.
I'm happy to be here, too. I am not I'm a political geographer. I specialize in the Middle East, and so when Valerie Hudson approached me about starting the Women's Stats Project, I saw it as a great opportunity to broaden my interests, and I've been fascinated with what has come of this, and I've enjoyed it very much. Our two other authors that were not able to be here, this is not the, it was a windy day in Duluth, Minnesota, but Mary Caprioli is on the left, and she couldn't be here, and then Bonnie Ballas-Spanville is on the right. She just retired as the head of the Women's Research Institute at Brigham Young University, so we appreciate their help too. In looking at, let's see if I get this right, one of the things we wanted to do for this book was to have it be something that you could look at and understand, and as a geographer, I think maps oftentimes tell a wonderful story. I've had some friends who, when they see the title of this book, think there might be something interesting inside, and there are maps that are interesting. And at Brigham Young University, I can proudly say that it's a I guess you can say kosher for Mormons too, but it's an allowed book. And but the maps, a lot of people have this mental map in their mind of perhaps where women are. Their circumstances are less than favorable. And so we created, I think it's 11 maps, and showing the different scales that we created from our data. This first one you can see trafficking of females, and you can see there's no real pattern, that there are countries, the darker the color, the worse off it is for women in terms of trafficking. And you can see some in Latin America, Africa, Asia. There's no real pattern, but that there are areas where women are very vulnerable. Polygamy, you can see sub-Saharan Africa, generally a higher number of women involved in polygamous relationships. And interestingly, you look at the Islamic world, and North Africa in particular, and even though Islam allows multiple wives, it's not as predominant there as in some of the sub-Saharan African countries. Maternal mortality, definite patterns there, sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a lot of work that can be done there in South Asia too. But then interestingly, you look at a country like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Bahrain, where women are, they have access to health care, but the fact that the governments will provide women OBGYNs or will provide health care services for mothers, you see that where you think that perhaps women in the Islamic world are oppressed, but women as mothers in the Islamic world have a more favorable status than in other parts of the world. And so you can't necessarily just blanket condemn in a blanket term Islam for the way it treats women in one way versus women in another way. Sex preference and son ratio looks at that gross imbalance that we find now because of China's one-child policy, because of infanticide, because of sex-selective abortions. And you can see here again that girls, female fetuses in the Islamic world are better off than in the Confucian countries of East Asia or in the Hindu country of India and South Asia, where there it is very vulnerable to be conceived as a girl. And so you see at different stages in life, women's lives can be more vulnerable than at other stages in life. And the data and the maps, I think, very clearly show some of that. Women's physical security looks at issues of rape and domestic violence and murder. And here you can see with this composite index, looking at these various variables, the deplorable status of women in much of the world, and no country was women are peacefully secure. There are still, even in Western Europe and North America that generally have a better status for women, you still see that there are some countries where, within all countries, women are still vulnerable. And it's not just our research didn't just look at laws. Are there laws against rape? But we looked at, are those laws then prosecuted? What is the societal view of rape? Are rapists allowed to get off with a few years, or are they even brought to trial? And so In most countries, there is still a lot, in all countries, there's still room for improvement. One of the things we wanted to do in our book is not only talk about the status of women, but we also wanted to look at what can be done to perhaps improve the status of women. And so we look at top-down efforts, state-initiated efforts, and also bottom-up efforts. And part of my contribution to the book was to look at women, particularly in the Islamic world, and what they're doing. And actually, it was one of my cousins that's here today said, "What's a white Mormon male doing talking about women in the Islamic world?" And that is, but I don't think it's for me to say this is what you should do, but what we want to do is to show what women in the Islamic world, within their own culture, within their own tradition, have chosen to do. And I want to highlight, as we talk about some of these maps, what some of these women have done. Rania Albaz is a morning news host in Saudi Arabia. A few years ago, her husband got angry at her, pounded her head into the marble floor while her 5-year-old son was watching. Intending to kill her, she revived, and so he then panicked and took her to the hospital. And while she was recovering in the hospital, her father came and took the photo on the right, and she had this decision to make. Do I remain silent or do I speak up? And she said, as a broadcast journalist, I needed to speak up and bring light to the fact that women in Saudi Arabia are not secure, and that needed to be part of the discussion. And so you see very brave women who stand up and say something needs to change. Another map, discrepant government behavior concerning women, looks at how countries comply with the CEDAW UN standard of how women should be treated. It's the CEDAW stands for the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and most countries in the world have signed on to this, saying yes, we will treat women better. But this map looks at those countries that actually comply with those regulations, and you see that there is, for lack of a better word, a lot of hypocrisy, where countries say we're wonderful, and what our coders know is there are these shadow CEDAW reports where non-governmental agencies will go in and say, this is actually how it is for women in the country. You know, the government says one thing, but the reality is much different. And here you can see, again, the variance in the patterns, and less developed countries generally not quite as compliant with the CEDAW regulations. In looking at the CEDAW is one of the things is it tries to eliminate female genital mutilation. And this is the Waris Dari, I can't. Yeah. She underwent female genital, Waris Diri. She's from Somalia, 5 years old. Her mother and some other women, tied her down, cut off part of her genitals, and later on she became a world-famous model, established this organization to combat female genital mutilation. And this is an advertisement that they did in Germany where it shows this beautiful woman, and across the screen in German comes words like beautiful and lovely, and then the final statement, you can see there the translation below, and it's just drawing an emphasis to this deplorable feeling that for a woman to be complete, to be beautiful, something needs to be done to take away the joy of sexual intimacy. And so here you have a Muslim woman from Somalia using her voice, her money, her fame to try and bring about change. Government participation by women, you can see again, some countries do better than others. In Kuwait, Masuma Al-Mubarak, she has a PhD from the University of Denver, went back to Kuwait, lobbied for the right of women to vote. When that was granted in, I think, 2005, she was then accepted to be asked to be the first, to be the Minister of Planning, and then in 2009 she was elected one of the first of 4 female members to be elected to Parliament. So Muslim women making efforts to improve the involvement of women in the governmental process. Discrepancy in education. Again, you can see in North Africa, fairly Algeria, Libya, Tunisia is similar to West Africa or Western Europe, North America. So some areas in the Islamic world you have parity in education. Women have the same rights as men. One example, one of the more deplorable examples, comes from Afghanistan, where you may remember a few years ago a New York Times article talking about this young girl, Shamsia Husseini. She and her sisters were walking to school, and some men came up, asked them where they were going. When they said school, they pulled off their burqa, threw acid in their face, and this girl, well, the schoolmaster, he said to the parents, he said, I told them, if you don't send your daughters to school, then the enemy wins. I told them not to give in to darkness. Education is the way to improve our society. And so Shamsia said, the people who did this to me don't want women to be educated. They want us to be stupid things. And you read about these young girls and you think of their bravery of just saying, we defy the Taliban. We defy men who will not allow us to go to school. That's our right. And those girls all went back to school. And that is, it's exciting to see these bottom-up efforts where women and men within their own cultures, within their own societies, are making changes. I like this one in Saudi Arabia where a girl asked King Fahd, why don't the girls have sports programs in schools? And so it's amazing to just see an 8-year-old girl speak up to the prince. And he said, I hope to see sports courts in girls' schools. And I don't know if that's happened yet, but just speaking up can improve the status of women. Inequity in family law looks at issues of inheritance, of land ownership, of child custody, of spousal support. And again, here you can see sub-Saharan Africa, much of the Islamic world, more problematic, but then you see other countries that stand out. A good example of somebody trying to make change is a female attorney in Malaysia who organized Sisters in Islam, trying to help women with these legal issues. And as she learned more about Islam, one of the things she said is that it was a liberating process, understanding that the Quran speaks to women and is lifting and empowering. And that's one thing that I found, is that there are many Muslim women who are saying, within Islam, we need to go back to what the original teachings were and not what the medieval patriarchal interpretations of Islam were. And so there's a growing movement of Muslim women saying, we need to reconsider what Islam actually says, what the Quran says, what the Hadith says, and not what later interpretations say. And so you see women working in that area too. This is one of our newer maps. It's one that doesn't show up in the book, but it looks at the practice of child marriage for girls. You can see the Sahel region of Africa, South Asia, where women, girls as young as 10 are married. There's the story of Nuj Ali. You may have heard of her, from Yemen, 10-year-old girl married to, I think, a 40-year-old cousin, and one day she just got up the courage. Somebody had told her that you could get a cab and it would take you to a judge, and that judge would grant you a divorce. And so she did that. And she went to the judge and said, I want a divorce. And another judge said, I'll help you. And another female attorney says, you can come and stay at my home. And she was granted a divorce for being forced into a marriage that she didn't want to do as a child bride. And it's those type of things that are, to me, are very encouraging. Within the Islamic world, we looked at required codes of dress for women. And you can see Saudi Arabia and Iran in particular, where women are required to be covered, and they're forced to dress a certain way. But conversely, and this is interesting, if you look at Tunisia and Turkey, their women are punished if they veil. Other countries are punished if they don't veil, and both, to me, are discriminatory. Women should have the right to choose whichever. But so there's this ongoing debate within Islam. Lubna Husseini is a journalist in Sudan who she and 10 other women were brought to trial for wearing pants. 8 of the women were flogged as their punishment. Lubna chose to go to court to bring attention to the fact that women in the Sudan are forced to dress a certain way. And then our final map, intermingling in public. Can women drive, Do women need permission to leave the country? Are there segregated cinemas or restaurants? And again, you can see variance within the Islamic world. It's not monolithic. It's not all the same. There are some countries that are very progressive in terms of within Islam for how women should be, how they can intermingle in public. One of our favorite stories that we use in the book, and this is a fun one, a few years ago, she's a headmistress in Saudi Arabia who wanted to drive. And so she got a car, and she had an international driver's license. And so she started to drive through the streets of Riyadh. The religious police pulled her over and said, "You can't do that. You need a male chauffeur." So she hired a male chauffeur, put him in the back seat, and she continued to drive. And so she was pulled over again and says, "You can't do this. He should be driving." And so then she says, "Well, that's not going to work. I'm going to start riding my bike through the streets of Riyadh." So she got a bike and started to ride through the streets of Riyadh. They pulled her over and said, "You're out unaccompanied. You need protection. You can't do this." So her Trump act was she finally then got a donkey and started to ride a donkey through the streets of Riyadh. And the religious police pulled her over and said, "You can't do that." And she said, "But the female companions of the Prophet rode donkeys through the streets of Arabia. If they did, why can't I?" And the religious police were, they couldn't respond because there was a precedent that, in the time of Muhammad, women rode donkeys freely through the streets. So they have yet to grant women the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, but there's a growing movement. And so it's heartwarming to see these efforts, these bottom-up efforts. And we hope as co-authors in this book that public policy people and local leaders will read it and say, yeah, that is something we can do. That is something we can change. And we hope it starts a dialogue, a conversation that leads to action where people actually implement new policies that will favor the improved status of women. Thank you.
I'm Jenny Klugman from the World Bank. Sorry for arriving a bit late and missing part of what was a very interesting presentation. I had a chance to look over in advance from Valerie, but I had an opportunity to listen to the second part. What I've been asked to do today is to present some highlights from the recent World Development Report 2012, which was launched by the World Bank in the fall. It's the annual kind of research flagship report of the World Bank. It's been published for the last, I think, 35 odd years. And for the first time ever in 2012, the topic of the report is gender equality. Clearly long overdue, but I think at the same time an important landmark in terms of bringing together knowledge around the issue of gender equality and providing a foundation, I think, for some of the thinking on the way forward. And what I was going to do in particular in response to Sandeep's suggestion was to focus on one of the issues which is picked up in the report, the issue of the problem challenge around missing women. But I'll also talk about some of the broader context as well. If you have a chance to look at the report, and hopefully there are flyers, I think, outside. It has an iPad app and so on. You'll see what you have a chance to delve into the report. And what it does, broadly speaking, is look at trends in gender equality. It defines gender equality quite broadly, so not only in terms of, for example, education health outcomes, but I think very similar to the approach adopted in the book, looking at multiple dimensions of well-being. So looking at voice and agency, looking at economic opportunities, and looking at trends over time. And it shows, broadly speaking, that there has been considerable progress over the last 3 or 4 decades, which is the time period under consideration, but at the same time that there are very persistent gaps in very important areas. It shows why these gaps matter, both intrinsically as an issue of rights, but also showing the implications, the adverse repercussions for development because of these gaps. It tries to understand why these persist, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So trying to understand, why we continue to observe these inequalities over time, and of course, as well, it tries to lay out the associated policy implications, what we should be doing to address these challenges. So on the turning kind of most directly to the dimension of health and well-being on that front. Here, there's, I think, a significant paradox, and in fact, we see this across several areas of well-being. Because on the one hand, there have been enormous advances in terms of life expectancy, which oftentimes is used as, if you like, the base or summary indicator of well-being. I came from the Human Development Report to this job relatively recently, and some of you may know the Human Development Index, and the summary indicator we use there is the HDI and life expectancy. So there's been an improvement of around 20 years over the past 50 years, which is an enormous improvement within a relatively short period of time. But at the same time, relative to boys and men, there's still enormous excess mortality, and this is the issue of missing women. And this shows very serious disadvantage facing kind of girls and women around the world. And let me go a little bit more into the profile of this. And actually, Chad has already kind of given, I think, a broad overview of the situation, but let me go into it a little bit more. When we look at this kind of aggregate, or how do we come up with this aggregate number? It's comparing sex ratios relative to what is the case in rich countries. So it's comparing developing country sex ratios with that which we see in kind of basically OECD countries. And it looks at where females are missing in different age cohorts. So, for example, we see females who are missing at birth. And that's the fairly well-known problem of sex-selective abortions in particular, and some preference in particular in China and India. And these are annual figures here. So this is 1.25 million girls who are never born every year in China and India, a lesser number but still significant in sub-Saharan Africa. And then we have the girls who die before they reach their 5th birthday. And then a particular problem there seems to be related to inadequate water and bad sanitation. I'll get into that a little bit later. And then, of course, we still have fairly high rates of maternal mortality, which are affecting women of childbearing age, and they're the numbers that we see there. So that's, if you like, the demographic breakdown. And then we see, if we look to see where this is happening, this is our map, not quite as nice as the maps have been, the geographers managed to put together. We can see here, kind of broadly speaking, the patterns around the world. And I guess there's a couple of things to note here. If we look over time, it's certainly true that these preferences don't change easily. They often tend to be persistent, and indeed, it seems that in some places, increasing wealth and technology have actually exacerbated the problems. On the other hand, I think it's also important to note that change is not impossible. And I think here, South Korea is quite an interesting example, because they have the highest male-female sex ratio in Asia. But it peaked in the mid-90s, and then it's changed quite significantly since then. So I think it's important to not be, if you like, overly pessimistic, and think about, look to the cases where there have been changes over time. So that the first map was looking at the problem of girls missing at birth. This one is looking at excess female mortality after birth, and here, as already previously been mentioned, there's very much a concentration in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Maternal mortality is an important part of this story here, and I think trying to understand what's driving these continuing high rates, I think, is no longer related to kind of simple technical reasons, because we know, what's needed to reduce maternal mortality. I think there's very important issues around kind of political commitment, political economy, and so on, which mean, as well as social and institutional norms, which means that these gaps continue to persist. And what the report actually does, I think, quite usefully, is to try and frame kind of our understanding and analysis of the underlying determinants in terms of these, if you like, cogs in the wheel. And so what you see here on the right-hand side different dimensions of gender equality, different dimensions of well-being, related to economic opportunities, related to endowments, which include, for example, education, health endowments, as well as related to voice and agency. And clearly those are very much interrelated, but we can somewhat distinguish those. But then on the other hand, what we can see is kind of the different underlying determinants and how these also interrelate with each other. So on the one hand, we can see formal institutions, formal policies. So, for example, a formal policy that girls shall go to school, or a formal policy against domestic violence, for example. But whether or not that makes any difference, for example, on the schooling side in terms of women's economic opportunities, depends on informal institutions. It depends on how markets operate and what's happening at the household level. Similarly, with respect to other examples, and the report has quite nice analysis of how, in some areas, we can see how there's been a confluence of positive factors which have led to some improvements over time. And I think education and the improvements in parity in primary and secondary schooling, and indeed a situation today globally where there are more women in college than men, is one where we can see the influence of important policies coming together to allow changes. So, for example, the abolition of fees, the introduction of incentives to send kids to school, and so these various things coming, and greater economic opportunities for women, so those things lending or tending to improve outcomes over time. And then we look at the case of economic opportunities where there's evidently much less progress. So, for example, in terms of earnings gaps and wage gaps and occupational segregation, we can see a bunch of things in the different cogs in the wheel biased against women and operating, if you like, conspiring together. And so one of the important, I think, messages that come out of this framework is that you can intervene, if you like, in one domain, for example, make a formal policy change, but unless you're thinking about what's happening kind of with respect to the other norms, for example, the social norms regarding housework, what's happening at home, what's happening in terms of market access to credit and so on, not necessarily going to realise the hoped for gains. So what do we do to eliminate these gaps? I mean, clearly it's an enormous agenda. What the report does is lay out kind of key priorities. I think an important recognition, not necessarily new for everybody in the room, but I think somewhat new or novel for the World Bank, is an explicit recognition that these gaps do not disappear with growth. Okay, so we can, and that came up very clearly, I think, from the earlier presentation as well. So there's a need for kind of corrective, proactive public policies to address these gaps, and with respect to human endowments, with respect to earnings and productivity, with respect to voice and agency, and importantly as well because of the reproduction of these inequalities over time. There's actually quite a nice graph, I didn't put it in the presentation, just specifically on the excess female mortality, and it shows the lack of correlation there with growth. So let me just quickly go through some of the key priorities. These are very much at the global level. This is not a prescription for any particular country. This is, if you like, a very broad agenda, what comes out in the report. So it's focusing on, for example, clean water and sanitation, as I mentioned, as being a determinant, or a key underlying determinant of better health of young children. Maternal services, clearly a priority in reducing maternal mortality, as well as highlighting the importance of HIV AIDS programs, because in Africa in particular, I think the figures at the moment are about 60% of those affected are women. I don't want to be kind of too sanguine on the education side. There's been enormous progress, but there's still some 35 million girls of school age who are currently not attending school. This is very much a case now of overlapping disparities. So often girls in rural areas, indigenous groups, poor groups who are not able to attend school, and so that remains an important agenda there. And there are some nice examples if there's time for discussion about what's some initiatives on that front. On the economic opportunities side, this is something which brings in, I think, that the other areas very importantly. It relates to alleviating time constraints to enable women to participate, which has to do with investments in infrastructure, investments in enabling access to affordable childcare, for example. There's an important agenda around land and credit. And then there's also important kind of market kind of failures and institutional constraints. And actually one thing which came to mind, and I don't know how it compares actually in terms of the data that you have in your book, but the bank actually has for the last, 4 years been publishing something called Women, Business and the Law. which covers 141 countries around the world. And it looks at 8 so-called domains of equality. And it's motivated, if you like, by kind of the economic opportunities, but it looks very at the family law restrictions, property law, contract law, citizenship, all of those things, because we know all of those affect economic opportunities as well. Anyway, so it would be quite nice to that's also free and available online if anyone wants to go and have a look at that. It was most recently updated, again, just in the fall. And that documents quite well, at least where there's formal discrimination. And then on the voice and agency side, again, there's a whole gamut. This is a relatively new area, admittedly, for the World Bank, but it's an area where there is some interesting work. I think some of it originated in post-conflict countries around gender-based violence, for example. But we've just recently included measures to tackle gender-based violence in Brazil, for example, state-based lending, development policy lending in Brazil, and important issues, of course, around participation and fertility. And then finally, of course, investing in girls and building their capacity and supporting transitions and so on. There's an interesting discussion in the report around the role of the international community. It very much emphasizes the importance of domestic, national political commitment and the political economy around those reforms. But it also shows the importance, or kind of underlines the importance of the global agenda, which is complementary to these national actions, and the role, for example, of institutions like the World Bank in providing financing, because there are still financing gaps in some of these areas, fostering innovation and learning. There's still a lot that we don't know, as well as working in partnership. Thank you.
Yes, I do. Well, good morning. I guess I'm afternoon. So I guess I'm the real discussant here, and I see the role of a discussant as being critical to a certain extent, applauding where people have done a great job, and finding areas in which one might disagree, or one might see that the job hasn't been done completely as I might have done it, or I thought I might have done it, or someone might have done it. It's a tough job, particularly because I know the lead author here very well. I want her to continue to email me. And discuss things. We're both on the, actually I'm the new chair of the International Studies Association Political Demography and Geography section. And Valerie's on the board. And I did like this book. I read it from one side to the next, and I read every chapter and enjoyed every chapter. Did I learn something? I certainly did, and you've highlighted some things that you pointed out. It is a big charge. You took on a lot. You must, what we're talking about is in a world governed by men, largely countries governed by men. How do you, who appeal for their power largely to communities, also controlled by men? How do you convince them that giving up some of their power is in their best interest? That's a tough order. And I, for one, believe that because we live in nation states that have boundaries, and because these rules which have been in place are put on certain constraints to governance and prosperity and peace and conflict, that it turns out that, in fact, they're not barking up the wrong tree. Now the question, and I didn't come into this research thinking that, quite frankly. I think I started to do the work, and I arrived at a position that's not too far from the authors, that it is in the best interest of men to give up power, because the ultimate product is something that is much more in line with what we hope for from the modern nation state. That said, there is, it may be only for a certain amount of time, and I'll point to that, and Valerie's already alluded to it a little bit. But the book starts with an ideological premise. Of course, it comes from a feminist perspective, and it purports to identify links between women's rights and status and states' propensity for conflict and violence. Now, what's wrong with an ideological perspective? And in the social sciences, I think nothing really, to a certain point. And because ideologies, you need them, because almost every discipline in social sciences has a historic, it has a history that of a time, of an ideology. It focused on certain things that it thought were important at the time, and these have come into place. These fix those disciplines, and to, as Valerie pointed out, and Chad did too, that to say something that may not be intuitive, given where we are, we're not in the conventional wisdom, takes some kind of inner belief, some kind of faith that these things are really important. So it's, as a generator of hypotheses, it's very, very valuable to have some kind of belief. Now, after that, you really have to convince the unconvinced. And did this book do it? In other words, they weren't barking on the wrong tree. How far did they get up the tree? And I would say about halfway. They got up, and quite frankly, they start out from the beginning warning you of that this is the beginning of a long venture, and that they can't prove causality with all the things that they talk about, particularly the statistical analysis. And but they point to certain relationships that are worth thinking about. So I don't think they're shocked, maybe, that I don't think that they made it all the way. I don't think that they thought they would. And if I had another criticism, and I do, I enjoyed every chapter, but for this work, to bring it into one sort of cohesive work in which you went from beginning to end, and you still had the same thoughts in your mind, and I don't think, I never felt that. I felt that I was listening to somebody else's voices. I would go to another chapter. I enjoyed every chapter, but to me it was a very different voice. And so it was hard for me to sometimes bring them together. But that said, that's what happens when you take on something that's as huge and as and when you decide to be the vanguard of something that is truly a difficult undertaking and a worthy undertaking. I had, if I can find my place here, I had some little. In one example, I mean, the authors talk about what they believe and what sort of is their conclusion, and I think this sums it up a bit here. They talk about the State Department's women human rights defenders, and how they are asked to investigate and report issues that the state, some foreign state, must address to protect women. And the authors state, in practice, however, many states do not support WHRDs, these rights defenders, in their country, and often oppress them. If states understood the connection between security of women and national security, they would ensure that WHRDs were protected. That to me is a real stretch. You're asking for them to say, okay, I'm going to bring in WHRD or allow these reports to be made, and I'm going to be better off for it. It goes back to that initial question. And it's hard to, even though I personally, I think I believe it. I believe maybe in a different context, in a long period of the types of reforms that the authors actually do a great job at highlighting, talking about Moroccan history of reforms, the recent reforms, CEDAW, and what I really like about their sort of their feminist approach is that it's much less restrictive than the usual quote unquote Marxist feminist approach, which would exclude things like fertility and access to contraception. They don't hold those bounds. They've dropped them in the interest of, I think, a much broader perspective, which is laudable. They also talk about the Women's Stat Database, and I went and tried to generate my own analyses using the database and try to replicate some of the things that they did. And I'm a bit critical of the indicator that they used as a dependent variable. In other words, their image of peace, they thought, was exemplified or represented by the Global Peace Index. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Global Peace Index. It's generated by the Institute for Economics and Peace, which is an Australian institute. And it's on a website, and it's available. It's kind of hard to get. How it's generated is a little hard to get, but it's there in a working paper. But to sum it up, the GPI is an index with 23 variables. They're all added together. So in other words, the analysis that's in the book that and Mary Caprioli has done others, you take indices that are sort of maybe a checklist of the one I'm thinking of is the inequality of family law. So there's a checklist of equalities and inequalities that she goes to, that the generator of that is someone else who creates this index or assessment. And then you take that and you put that in a statistical program which adds others to it and compares them, and then the output is supposed to look like another index of 23 things, So you got many things combined in many ways to make something that's made of 23 variables. That's pretty tough, to me, I don't see what you know at the end of this, except that maybe you have a correlation. And I tried. I didn't use the methods that one of the authors did, I actually couldn't recreate it. I couldn't either. I threw in my own variable, which, if you know my work, I work with age structure. It didn't work too well either. But what happened with the variable that the Institute for Economics and Peace generated is that I come up with the conclusions that they do, that economics is important. And, it's kind of a no-brainer. You put together an index and to show that economics is important, and what do you come out with on the other side? That economics is important. And I don't argue with that. That almost every analysis that is done using civil conflict, other types of violence, once they control for economics, they find that it is significant. So that is wealth, not growth. So I don't argue with the generators of this, but I just myself, I wasn't able to either find age structure or IFL anyway, that one to be very significant. And for economics, it only accounted for less than 30% of the variance, which isn't a lot. So this scatter, I'm not convinced by this at all. But I did find some things that are interesting, and I took that I thought I would take out of this, and I looked at the inequity in family law, which is on women's stat database. And the women's stat database is really worth looking at, and it's very easy to access and take the data off. I wish it gave more than 5 countries at a time, but I don't know how.
You can download it all.
Can I? Okay.
Into an Excel spreadsheet, right on your desktop.
Oh, great. Okay, so I didn't do that. I did it the hard way.
Oh, boy, that was really hard then.
So I was up late last night. But I looked at 2011. I looked at the IFL, and I thought, well, it should correlate with GDP per capita in PPP terms, whatever that means. I can't remember. Was it purchasing power parity? Right.
Something like
Thank
that.
you. That's right. So, and really, if you look at it, there's that first slide. I guess it does. I mean, the value, it should not be. The line is just to guide your eyes because they're really categorical variables.
Yeah. You've got to do categorical analysis.
Right. So I did analysis of variance, and I looked at this, but you see the first 3 categories, and 4 is in this one is the most unequal. The first 3 categories don't really, even despite GDP per capita, it's quite remarkable. You would think that countries that were rich would somehow afford, maybe, to grant women a certain amount of power just because they want to enlist them in the workforce. But that's not the case. There is some, when you get to the end of the line, there is some differences. But let's see. Now I did something. I looked at median age, which is a way to look at age structure. People use the youth bulge indices, and they use dependency ratios. But I just looked at that, and actually it's quite discerning. Not every one of these categories are statistically different, but in a line they are. It's really quite remarkable that the older the population gets, the more less unequal family law becomes. Now, what does that mean? To me, it must mean that family law is instrumental, maybe, or at least it reflects conditions that allow fertility to decline, and which is, I think, is an interesting finding. And here's a box plot, and if you're familiar with these, it just shows how the median age, the gray boxes are the 50% center of the distribution, the middle 50% of distribution. So you can see that there really are quite big differences just from median age. Now, this starts, when you look at that, of course, the oldest group there, where there is completely equal family law, that group is around, on average, 41 years median age. So we're moving into a period that is what would be a mature population, moving toward what I like to call a post-mature one, which is one that Japan, Germany, and an age structure that Japan, Germany, and Italy are now facing. So the question remains, which is not addressed by the authors, is, well, okay, you grant family law and we have very low fertility. Is that good for the state as we know it? Now, we can't answer that question because we don't know where these states are going yet. But we're facing, at least for those countries in the very immediate future, a situation where at least the welfare state was created in a more youthful period. And there's now a problem in meeting the obligations that the state has accrued or accepted during that, in its history. It now has an age structure that just doesn't permit it to spend the funds that it promised and to have an economy, to generate wealth as it did once before, and growth in particular. Growth is very difficult for more mature countries, as far as we know. So it's a part, you've done a part of the story. Once again, Valerie's already alluded to the point to the fact that when we look at Northern European states in particular, and we see the breakdown of marriage and as we know it, and the response of the state to try to make childbearing more easy for working women, then we do see a rebound in fertility. Fertility is coming up in Northern Europe slowly. So I'm not saying the battle's lost, but certainly, and interestingly, a lot of the things that people in this room have fought for, lower fertility, has gone to an extent that it may indeed threaten the nation state as we know it. So I'd like to hear what you'd say about that. But all in all, I enjoyed the book. I felt it was my obligation to be a bit critical. And as a discussant, to get your sandwich worth. And I'm glad I did read it. And thank you for your book and your presentations. And I hope we're still friends after.
Sandeep, would you like a response?
Sure. I was going to say if any of you want to take a few minutes to respond, and then I certainly want to make sure we leave enough time for audience questions. And I know I have a question myself too.
Well, I'll go ahead and respond, since Rich and I have known each other for years, and we are friends. And I'll continue to work with you after that. It's interesting that Rich starts out with the question, how do you convince men that giving up some of their power is a good thing to do? And I think that's a good insight. And what's interesting is to see, even in our conversation, that men who are unconvinced may be less willing to see the state move in directions such as protecting women's human rights defenders and so forth. So I think the convincing is necessary. And if we haven't done as good a job as you would like us to do, we'll have a second book. How's that? Ideological perspective. I did want to mention that, is that as social scientists, we don't feel we're coming from an ideological perspective. We think we're coming from a theoretical perspective. And that is, over the course of the last decade, we've developed and detailed, explicated. In fact, there's like an entire chapter on the theoretical framework that we've developed, which we don't think is primed by ideology, but we think rather allows us to generate the kinds of hypotheses that we wish to subject to empirical test. So I think we would differ. What you call ideology, I would say this is theory that's based in social psychology, sociology, and evolutionary biology. Is where we'd be coming from. The GPI, yes, GPI has a 23 variable index. We also ran our analyses with some of the individual indicators that GPI uses as well. It's actually the Economist Intelligence Unit that produces the numbers for the GPI. So it's
the basis. So this is.
This is the EIU that's producing these on a yearly basis. And so we've taken their overall measure as well as sub-measures in our analysis. And you kind of lost me a little bit. IFL doesn't have 23.
No,
you were saying, okay, I must have just simply misunderstood that. So we've used those. We've also developed our own index. One of our graduate students who's now at Yale, not the other one, I guess I have two at Yale, has developed their own index of treaty compliance. And so there was a variety of different dependent variables and in addition to the overall GPI measure. But I think your most important points were towards the end, which is looking at the role of economics. That is to say that one of the alternative hypotheses that we've paid attention to is, does economics explain what we're seeing better than what's happening with women? Now, it's a little bit of a red herring because, as I detailed in my presentation, for many countries, you cannot completely disentangle economics with what's happening with women on the ground. So there's, shall we say, a little bit of collinearity there in terms of how you would conceptualize those variables. But I think that you yourself, the three charts that you showed us, add to the discussion. So, for example, rich nations are not necessarily better on inequity and family law, but inequity that explains why we found that inequity in family law was a much better predictor of state security and stability than wealth was. So I think, you've kind of added to our discussion, and I'd be happy to steal your chart and put it in a future publication. I think your last point is also very well taken. Is what we found. You've raised the question of, does ensuring equity in family law actually lead to sub-replacement birth rates, which then are not good for the nation state? Well, I think, as you yourself suggested, is that there's a huge part of what we're missing in that analysis, which is social support for motherhood, right? So inequity in family law variables that look at, are there minimum ages of marriage for girls? Does a woman have to give sincere consent in marriage? Are divorce arrangements equitable or not? Custody arrangements, inheritance rights, and so forth. That doesn't include anything, really, about social support for mothering within the society. So I think what you find is that as women gain rights as human beings within the marriage relationship, fertility naturally falls. In fact, we should expect this because, the Cairo Conference and other conferences have said that if you give women basic human rights as married women, you're going to see a fall in fertility, and you do. Okay, but then at some point in your post-industrial societies, you can't just address equity. You've also now got to talk about unpaid reproductive labor, whether it's valued, whether mothers can operate with a social safety net. As you know, researchers in our own land, where, by the way, we still don't have any paid maternity leave. I think we're now down to one of 3 nations in the entire, we used to be one of 4, but I think we're now down to one of 3 nations in the entire world that do not provide any paid maternity leave. Right? That is a way of punishing any woman who wants to actively participate in the workforce as well as engage in reproduction. Okay, so when you say, does equity in family law then lead to sub-replacement birth rates, I would say, it starts to lower, and then when you begin to actively, in a sense, punish women for having children is when you will see sub-replacement birth rates begin to hit. As you've well noted, is that when states start to address that issue, you can see some rebounds in fertility. It has, to my knowledge, I think except for, is it Sweden and possibly France, we've not yet seen a return to replacement fertility, have we? You would know. Okay. So I think Sweden and France, although they've had the most long-standing social safety net for women.
Not quite back there yet either, but at least they're
within spitting distance of replacement fertility rates. So yeah. So I think there's a missing piece there that would look at it. But Rich, you've now laid down a gauntlet. If we haven't convinced you, we're going to convince you.
No, I'm already convinced. The point is, the harder the people that are more difficult to convince. The state, the people who run that.
Are
state.
you representing the people who are unconvinced?
Somebody's got to do it. It's a hard job, but.
Can I make a comment about convincing the unconvinced? In one of our coder meetings with the students, I can't remember what we were talking about, but as you look at what's happened in the Arab world with the unconvinced in terms of political change, the leaders, it was a bottom-up kind of grassroots, let's bring about change. And we may never convince the men in charge, but I thought maybe we need an Arab women's spring where the women themselves actually say, okay, enough. And through these efforts, and maybe that's what it's going to take. I don't know that we'll ever convince the powers that be to this is for our collective good, but maybe if enough people in the trenches, on the ground, in the homes rise up, I don't know. I don't know if we're calling.
But you yourself noted that during revolutions, change in regimes, that that's when women very often lose their rights. That rights that they sometimes gained during an authoritarian regime, which is the case in North Africa.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
There's troubling things happening in Tunisia. There's troubling things in Egypt. There's troubling things in Libya. And so we hope we're not seeing this same pattern play out, where a change in the order in fact involves regress for women, because it's a change in the order among men, and it's not a change in the order of the entire society.
But you said something I thought I learned of it, is that very often in revolts you have the regime that comes into power needs to appeal to those structures that are sort of immovable, that are in the countryside, and they're very often male dominated. There's a appeal to the conservative aspects of society to join us. What do? You give up women's rights, because authoritarians very often put them in, which is I think we've seen it in Iraq, and we've seen it now when we pull out of Afghanistan. I think the Washington Post featured something on education yesterday.
Maybe the revolt, though, could be something different. I don't remember the specifics, but just last year, a group of women withheld intimacy from their husbands until something changed. And maybe it's that type of revolt, too, where women just say, it's not the armed struggle, but it's, we're tired of it.
Well, it does seem that we have some buzz coming from the audience. I think we have some folks that are anxious to ask questions. While my colleagues move around with the mics, I'm actually going to, that's the best part of being a moderator. You get to ask the first one if you want to. So, Jenny, I was hoping that you could shed some light, especially given your employment history and your focus on development. When we first started, we were hearing how the treatment of women was a key variable in the security of state, and I'm wondering if you could speak in terms of variables to economic development in a country. Where does the treatment of women fall? Would you say that would be one of the key variables, or I know you have a long history of looking at development in a number of angles. So,
sure. No, thank you. I think there's kind of a couple of things to say. One, I think it's really difficult with these cross-country correlations and so on to actually prove anything at all. And so I think it's interesting to look at the patterns and so on, but I think we have to be quite careful about drawing conclusions, because they're used in different sorts of ways. And so I think kind of understanding kind of patterns of change, both positive change as well as regression in communities, in countries and so on, in many ways can be much more insightful. So I think that's one thing to say on the, if you like, the methodological side. Secondly, I think it's really important to think about gender equality as an end in itself, rather than in purely instrumental kind of ways, because I think that it's important. It may be difficult to kind of persuade the Minister of Finance, for example, but I think that there is, growing recognition around the importance of the fundamental aspects of rights, and the provisions in CEDAW and other kind of important, very basic aspects of gender equality. And I think that kind of the broader democratization around the world in basic ways is important in that sense. But then thirdly, I think that the business case still remains very important. The World Bank promoted, I guess I can call it a slogan or a message, about gender equality being smart economics over the past several years, and documenting that in very important ways. So showing, for example, equalizing access to fertilizer and land, could lead to, double-figure increases in agricultural productivity, for example. Reducing occupational segregation, leading to very important outcomes as well in terms of improvements in income and growth. So I think that evidence does exist. I think it's difficult to show it at a global level. I think then the assumptions become really quite heroic, and you don't really want to necessarily rest your case on that. So I think it's important to continue to have the dual approach. And then I think very importantly as well, we need to work out how to bring about those increases in productivity. So for example, in Africa, we know that women farmers are less productive, and we know it's because they have less land, they have less fertilizer. We need to work out the ways to effectively overcome those constraints. So I think that the work at that level, at the program and policy level, and that can be replicated across different aspects, is very important as well. So I think the evidence does exist, and I think it's been very well documented in a range of circumstances. But I think that we need to work on, if you like, parallel tracks.
Why don't we get started from the audience? I see two back there, since the mics are already there, and then we'll move up to the front.
Hi, I'm Kristen Cordell. I'm an independent researcher currently on women, peace, and security. Thank you so much for the presentation. I found it extremely interesting and extremely useful for the work that we do. My question is for Valerie regarding the development of the data. I was recently involved with a civil society group that informed the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which came out last year.
Yeah.
And the U.S. government's now working on the implementation plans. And they consistently come back to the group and ask for the data. They've heard of the normative stories. They've seen the advocacy messages. They've seen the photos. And I think all those have a really strong place. But they need the data to continue to sell the plan, both internally and externally, to the missions abroad specifically, and also interagency-wide. So my question is, what are the next steps? How do we make this data relevant for them and the messages and the findings and the correlations that you've worked so hard to put together? How do we bring that to them in a way that's positive and reinforces the excellent work of Secretary Clinton and others to really make this a priority for the U.S. government?
Wow, that's a wonderful. First of all, I'm really excited to hear that you've been working on that action plan. Congratulations to you. That must be great work, very meaningful work. Second is, you're right. I think we all know that traditional feminist scholarship has relied primarily on discourse analysis, which, as you say, can be very insightful and can change minds and can motivate. But again, dealing with Rich's body of unconvinced persons, there must be more. And so there are some wonderful databases out there. A lot of times, however, we fall back to the same half dozen that we always look at. So, for example, enrollments in school. We look at percent national legislatures that are female, et cetera. You know the same six that I'm talking about. I think one of the strategic moves that we can make, and which is part of what we're doing in Women's Stats, is to let's look beyond that half dozen. There's a lot more that we can be talking about. So not just prevalence data, but also data concerning law, right? I think that's extremely important, and whether the law is being enforced. And then I think longitudinal data. We've got 10 years worth of data now. So we're beginning to get longitudinal. But as you move into longitudinal data, you can use higher powered statistical techniques from which you can impute causality. So that's another, I think, huge step in the right direction. And the third step is, as I think Jenny alluded to, is we have many people have come late to the game of looking at gender-based violence, right? That list of 6 usual variables examined do not include any variables on violence against women. So I think it's extremely important that we, in a sense, mainstream in a statistical sense what we know about violence against women. So those would be kind of, I think, the 3 priorities, and I'd be delighted to talk with you after about anything that we could do to assist you in your efforts.
While Stuart makes his way up here, Kaylee, why don't you grab the question in the back?
Thank you very much. I'm Julia Clancy Smith. I'm a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm also a women's historian, and I do women's history and global comparative perspective. And my region of expertise is Middle East, North Africa, Mediterranean world. And I'd like to really salute the authors of this book. It's as path-breaking as Cynthia Enlow's earlier stuff on women and war.
Well, we're such big fans. Did you really say that?
I really
my
said
gosh.
it. I know Cynthia well, and I
Enlow
know
is
her
one of
work.
our idols. So, wow.
This is second wave. Both of you, Chad and Valerie, this is second wave sort of research. And I'm also thinking about the work that Carolyn Bynum did in Women and Religion. It utterly changed the whole study of women and religion in history. So you guys are heroes for me, so thank you.
Thank you.
And also as someone who teaches and does research on the last 2 millennia of women's history in the Mediterranean world, I can think of lots of historical examples that where your data not only illustrates but validates people's, communities, societies, and cultures over the last 2 millennia. So I
We'd
don't
love
do
to hear about
fancy
that,
stats like Richard, but for many historians, you don't need those fancy stats because we have other sources of documentation. Here's my question. It has to do with profit and profits. And I mean P-R-O-F-I-T, and of course then the other kind of prophet, as in Prophet Muhammad, which my students can't spell either one, so but never mind. I guess my big question is about religion and sacred texts, and the fact that until women are not only allowed access to sacred texts or to interpret, but actually recognized as producers of knowledge about sacred texts, until that moment is reached, it seems to me we're going to keep running into obstacles. And I mean, religion is the big. It's in this country. It's out, and I define religion very generously. Not like it doesn't have to be a monotheistic, Abrahamic. You know, Chad did a lot of good stuff on Islam, which I support what he was saying. But so that's how do you somehow get religion into this discussion? So then we have the profit, P-R-O-F-I-T, and that is the fact that, let's face it, the U.S. economy is a war economy. We haven't been off a war economy since World War II. So we're making lots of money in this country on exporting warfare and violence to other parts of the globe. So how do we deal with women's gender inequality and the profit motive?
Do you want to speak
Thanks.
about religion for a moment?
Yeah, religion obviously comes up in the Middle East, and I was encouraged, and we didn't include a lot of this in the book, but looking at Islamic feminists, Muslim feminists, there is a growing movement by, and I alluded to this in my presentation, of Muslim women saying, let's reinterpret. And, you know, they come up against opposition, but then you see in Turkey, for example, they've now, the state has hired women to work within the mosque to do teaching to other women, and they're not the imam of the mosque, but they're, you know, Turkey is slowly saying women need to be involved, and the woman in Malaysia who is saying let's apply Islamic law a little bit differently. So you see the change, but I don't know how you bring about it from the top down. It's a hard thing.
I'm not sure you can bring it around from the top down, but there's things you can do to make it easier. I think that's probably the direction that we should go in. So, for example, in the book, we talk about how the Muslim Council in the UK has promulgated a new marriage contract, which they say is consonant not only with Sharia law, but consonant with the laws of the United Kingdom. So these attempts to find accommodations, that is to exist under the legal structure as it is, and yet try to find a fuller understanding, perhaps a female-based understanding of the scriptures together, I think is a nice 1-2 punch. I will add that I recently co-authored with Donnelly Bowen and Lynn Nielsen an article about how a move towards religious law enclaves actually decreases the security and safety of women in society. So I think another part of this is resistance to calls for those legal enclaves is huge. In terms of the war machine, you're right. One can only hope that we are finally segueing out of a war economy after 2014. We'll be out of Iraq. We'll be out of Afghanistan. Yes, there will be calls for the containment of China, and who knows, you know, what kind of return to a war economy will come from there. But there's some hope that we are now segueing into a new time period, and maybe that will have salutatory effects as well. Very, very good question.
Jenny, Rich, any further comments on profits and profits? No? Okay. We can.
Hi, my name is Shelley Snyder. I'm in the Office of Population at USAID, and I guess given where I come from, my question's for Dr. Klugman, and I was interested when you were talking about economic opportunity and education. You did not mention reproductive rights or abilities, because to me, if women cannot control their reproduction, they can't go to school, they can't participate in the workforce, and they can't participate in the Arab Spring. I mean, in Tunisia and Egypt, it was a lot of women participating in the Arab Spring, and in Yemen it wasn't. And Yemen has a tremendously high fertility and very low literacy, of course, too. So I just was interested that that didn't get discussed in your slides.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 400-page report, and I had, 8 slides or 10 slides or something. No, it's a very important issue, and it's addressed, I guess, most explicitly in the report in the context of agency, voice and agency. But it, obviously has, the point is that all of these things are interlocking, so I very much agree. And I didn't, I should have highlighted it in the summary version.
Hi, my name is Toby Whitman. I'm with Hun Alternatives Fund.
Toby Whitman, I know you.
And
Well, by email, I know you.
And the Institute for Inclusive Security. Just want to say, first off, the Women's Stats database is just the most amazing thing in the world, and you should all go home. And she's not paying me to say this, but do play with the numbers because it really is a tremendous resource. And I wanted to ask 2 questions. Firstly, for Valerie and Chad, just generally, what was the most surprising finding that really shocked you through your research? And then secondly, wanted to ask, in the last couple of years, there's been a push to draw a financial cost on sexual violence societies. The Department of Justice has just come out with a number on the cost of the U.S. I know The Economist as well has been doing it for a few years in various countries, and just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Kind of generally, is that a way to persuade some of the skeptics? And methodologically, have there been certain approaches that you believe are more sound than others? Thank you.
Well, I agree. Those Justice Department statistics are fantastic. I do believe they're a way to convince the unconvinced. It's also a way to sue for damages because you can then quantify what the damages were, all right? So absolutely, I'm all in favor of that. You asked a really interesting question about what surprised us the most. And I'll just give a couple of reactions and then see if Chad has some reactions. When we first made our scales, as you know, one of the things we do is not just compile information, but we also then try to distill out a general idea of what the situation in the nation is compared to other nations. So we do these scales. And I remember there was, in a sense, a conceptual issue that came up as we were beginning the scales. The first scale we did was the physical security of women scale. And Toby, we could not find one nation on the planet where we felt women were secure. Not one. And so we said, well, maybe what we ought to do is just take the range of the world as it is now, and we'll make our 0 point, our good point, the best nations currently. And we kind of stopped and we said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have a category for women are physically secure. And if it means that we don't actually have anybody in that category, for years, that's okay, because that's the reality of the situation. So that was kind of a big surprise for us, is if you see our physical security women's scale, there is not one country in the best category, not one. Second thing that surprised me is, I wrote the Bare Branches book on the sex ratios of China and Asia, or China and India. And I guess what was surprising for me over it's been almost 10 years since we published that work, was to see pockets of sex ratio abnormality begin to spring up in other areas far outside of East and South Asia. So, for example, Central Asia, Armenia and Azerbaijan, different religious traditions, and beginning to become a Bermuda Triangle for girls. Georgia, Bermuda Triangle for girls. So to see these pockets begin to crop up was extremely surprising to me, because they seem to have come out of, not nowhere, but where did they come from? Why has the situation worsened so much in the last 10 years in this particular area? So Chad, what surprised you?
I think for me, I come from a long line of strong women. Both my grandmothers, my mother college educated, taught school, put my dad through medical school. My wife has a master's degree from Harvard, has worked, got a bright teenage daughter, and I guess I was insulated, but I just, I looked at women and I thought, well, they can do whatever they want, and they're capable, and they have opportunities. And then weekly we meet with our student coders, and one of the things we do is they've been reading all of these reports and all of the articles. Is they'll share things that they've learned, and sometimes it's almost it's a very saddening experience, and it's just to read the stories of what happens in all parts of the world. It's just this overwhelming, and again, as a male, I just didn't, I've traveled a lot. I teach about the geography of women, and I'm sort of aware, but I think, to me, this project over the last 10 years has just brought an awareness of how far we still need to go, and how troubled women's lives can be in many parts of the world. Just last month, a 30-year-old niece of mine in Arizona, husband and daughter went off to work, and a neighbor forcibly entered and raped her. And that's in Arizona, and all at once it's part of my family, and I think this is in the United States. And so for me, it's very troubling, and I don't know that people understand. I don't know that they've ever put themselves in the shoes of what it's like to be a girl in Afghanistan, or even a grown woman in Prescott, Arizona, that there is much more that can be done.
I just want to be a little conscious of time here, so perhaps what we can do is collect a few questions and then give each of the speakers maybe a minute to respond to all the questions that come in. Did I see a few more?
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Shannon Zimmerman. I'm with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in North America. And I have two quick questions. CIPRI is primarily a data gathering institution.
So militarized interstate disputes. We love your mid-data.
Yeah, we have lots of things about arms and transfers like that, but we're thinking about trying to fill the gaps on data with women.
Really?
Which is what the North America branch...
CIPRI's going to get into women?
That's what the North America branch is for.
Women, that's fantastic.
So I would be interested to know, what gaps do you have that you saw were in the data? What was not there that you would have liked to be there?
Yes,
that
we
could possibly fill for you?
Yes, we do. Actually, it's we
Should
can...
we collect the other questions first?
And my quick second question was, with all of this great information that you've put together in your book, what would you like to see done with this information, as from a policy standpoint, from an intervention development standpoint? What can we do with the information that you've gathered?
Those action plans.
Yeah. Stuart, do you want to grab those two right there? And then, like I said, if everybody could just limit their comments back.
Good afternoon. My name is Patty Pennington. I am an independent researcher working on a very large project with the World Bank on gender. Background on course of the report, 97 communities are in focus groups.
Wow.
And what I'm seeing out of this work is we did a lot of work around agency and how men understand it and how women understand it, how they gain it, how they lose it. And in many ways, the men are feeling more disempowered. And so I think what I'm missing in your story are the men. And really, I think you started out and you grabbed me because you talked about the gang of men in control.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. You talked about the gang of men in control, but there's a lot of men who do not feel like they're in control. I have some communities in my study where I can see both men and women feeling in control, gaining agency. And in these contexts, the normative framework seems to shift, and you get, instead of the realist perspective of power and gender, you see more cooperative, less divisive relationships. And so there's a whole normative side to power which is often left out. And I also think men have an important role to play, that when we leave them out of the equation, you're not going to get the shifts that you're seeking. And so I'm just wondering, in your bottom-up perspective, do you have some men who have been real champions?
Hi, I'm Kathleen Barnett. I was previously at the International Center for Research on Women for many years, and I'm now an independent consultant on gender and economic development. and have had the pleasure to work with several colleagues here and have known for quite a long time the work of Valerie Hudson and was just thrilled by the event today. I skimmed the book. Can't say I read it thoroughly, but I loved it. I think it's fantastic, and congratulations, and I hope you have many years ahead on this work. I also congratulate Jenny and her World Bank colleagues on the WDR, which I think sets forth some very concrete and important approaches and strategies to issues. And I actually found the two works a good combination in a certain way, because I think that the book is a mix of very strong advocacy and an attempt to show academic research. I like the advocacy side the best in a way, but I think and I hope that it gets a big play, because I do think it's the academic work that gives you the credibility to do the advocacy. But I think you need to be clear who's the audience and who's really going to take your message and run with it, and which side do you need more work on. And on the WDR side, I'm really thinking, Jenny, maybe you would agree, that the more we can engage them in discussions with the development community, because they don't seem to really be rooted in our community, but we care a lot about these issues because of what Jenny said, that we see both a human rights angle, which is very strongly yours, women are half of the population, but also the argument that gender equality is smart economics. And you're trying to make an argument that gender equality is smart, human development in the long run sense, a kind of concept of communities where men and women are equal partners. And I think there's a lot to be gained by greater discussion between our two communities. I would also worry less about how to convince the unconvinced. I was thinking a little about the labor management disputes in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And, labor was never going to convince industry that they should pay better or give them, the weekends off or a break. They were never going to convince them. And change comes about in very different ways, I think. And I think making the case, and what I think is fantastic, I agree with the commentator who said your work is in many ways brilliant because it is so innovative. You're asking us to think in a completely different way. And I think a lot more work needs to be done, no question. But I really congratulate you on the work, and I hope there will be more venues for discussion with the development community.
Well, speaking of venues for discussion, I seem to have committed to taking one more question, which means the responses are really going to have to be elevator 30-second responses back. But if you want to go ahead, since I committed.
Hi, I am a research fellow at the Washington Area Women's Foundation and also a graduate student at the University of Maryland. I have sort of a theoretical question about how to measure autonomy as a factor in agency. So far, I've heard of agency measured in terms of life expectancy and participation in security negotiations, workforce education, and politics. However, I think that autonomy is also important in measuring agency. And I'm having some understanding how to measure that because of the problem of adaptive preferences. For example, women may claim to prefer working in sectors with lower wages or unequal occupations due to social pressure. However, in these situations, their autonomy is not necessarily upheld because these social pressures shape or adapt their preferences. Thus, it seems that there's a priority that women are autonomous and not overly pressured by these social contexts. And I wonder if you think that adaptive preferences could be, or the pressure to have adaptive preferences could be a gap in measuring female agency. And if it's a gap, and what are some ways to measure autonomy? And that's a question that I'm struggling with. I don't know if I've articulated that clearly enough, but I think that the capability for women to hold on to values and pursue goals is important in achieving agency. So that's why I'm interested in that.
Great. So perhaps what we can do is go in a little bit of a reverse order in terms of your quick responses back. Rich, if you wanted to start us off with anything, or Jenny, Chad.
Just very quickly, I think I very much agree with the suggestion that dialogue between kind of different communities is very important. And I think very fruitful for everyone. Just on the question that was just raised, that was something which we grappled with quite a lot when I was at the Human Development Report, because we're very much influenced by the work of Amartya Sen. But he's also someone who's very conscious of the kind of potential risk of subjective measures and adaptive preferences. And we kind of toyed with different things. If you look at last year's Human Development Report, the global one, 2010, we actually ended up using, Gallup has some questions there which are quite close to Sen's notion of agency about freedom to live the life that you choose. But then you're also, obviously subjected to these risks around adaptive preferences, and actually we disaggregated by gender and we didn't find much in terms of differences there. Anyway, so I think Sabina Al-Khairi, I think, has been doing the most interesting work on this, so I'd suggest you look at that.
Just quickly, two things. One about men in control, and this is, I guess, another thing that surprised me in our research, is that women are also perpetrators, that they're the ones that are often involved in the violence against women, and so it's not just men. And the other thing is we do have a section in the book about engage men, use men. One quick example, the coach of the Palestinian national soccer team insisted that there be a women's team alongside, and he became the coach. And so you see examples of men getting involved and saying, we can do better, but it's not that often.
Yeah, there's so much. Missing data. I can tell you what's not being collected on the women of the world, because I have 325 variables, some of which have very low coverage. That is, we have found very little data on them. So I can run you that report. I'd be delighted to talk with you. CIPRI, women. I mean, I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around this. This is exciting, very exciting. And what do we want to do with the data? Action plans, right? National action plans. We want to inform those and help concretize what needs to be done. I very much appreciate the remarks about men. I think men are a huge part of the solution, and to the extent that they're ignored, their agency in behalf of women is undercounted. So I think that the chapter on bottom up does have a lot of stories about sort of male heroes. In fact, someone was just telling me the other day that the most progress for women has been made by men who had daughters but no sons, which I thought was very interesting. I haven't looked into it, but I'm interested in talking about that. And the measurement, Kathleen had a question on who's going to take your message and run with it. Please help us. We are a couple of social scientists who are not located on the East Coast. Okay? How do I talk to Milan Verveer? I want to talk to Milan Verveer. Help me set that up. I will come out at my own expense, and so will Chad, and we'd be happy to share what we can do to empirically ground the arguments that we hear coming from the Office of Global Women's Issues. How to measure autonomy? That's a great question. That's not one of my 325 variables. However, I agree that is something that I would like to look at more and think about how we would examine that from the point of view of the Women's Stats database. And so if you have resources on that, I'd like to see them. Thank you.
So I certainly want to encourage everybody to continue this dialogue. I know that the speakers will probably be happy to stick around for a couple extra minutes. I also wanted to point out that we do have information about the report out in the front to grab, as well as the book on sale. I also wanted to encourage everybody to visit our website as well as our blog, and that's another way we can certainly continue the dialogue at newsecuritybeat.org. Lastly, I wanted to thank you all for making the discussion great and ask you to please join me in thanking the speakers. Thank you.